So picking right back up here, now we're going to talk about the economy in South Asia, starting mainly with the Indian Ocean Trade Network. So this probably should sound familiar to you because we've already talked about the Indian Ocean Trade Network before. Remember that this is an area that is largely influenced by the Muslim world. So don't feel like you're experiencing deja vu. This is something we've covered, right? So again, the whole Dar-al-Islam is connected through trade, right? Another thing that I would be remiss if I didn't mention was that this trade network existed prior to the founding of Islam, right? There is archaeological evidence suggesting that these trade connections were established as early as 500 BCE, right? So in any case, what we see here is that the vast reach of trade networks connected areas as far away as North Africa to Eastern Europe to Southwest Asia to South Asia and then beyond, right, through the South China Sea, even into East Asia. So the Indian Ocean transforms into an economic hotspot in the post-classical era. This is caused by a combination of merchants' connections to Dar-al-Islam and improvements in technology that allows people to go farther. We mentioned the dhow, the Indian Ocean trade ship, or the Arab trade ships that were common. So this is, again, something that facilitates this trade. This is another image of a dhow. In any case, like I was saying earlier, I might have been slightly off with my numbers. The trade networks through the Indian Ocean existed as far back as 200 BCE. I stand corrected. And when Islam expands, this connects even more cities than before. So it's not that the trade networks did not exist, but once the religion is founded and trade increases, and of course the population has increased, and again, technology has evolved, this makes the trade network that much larger. So the expansion, the trading partners existed in East Africa. We already talked about the Swahili city-states. In East and Southeast Asia, so places like China, Vietnam, Thailand, and all throughout Oceania. And also South Asia, which is predominantly India. Muslim Persians and Arabs were the dominant seafarers and were instrumental in transporting goods to port cities across the Indian Ocean. And cities on the west coast of India, places like Calicut, which is now Calcutta, Keelan, which we see here, sorry, Calicut was down there, Keelan and Cambay, all become very wealthy port cities and thriving centers of trade because there were constant interactions with merchants from East Africa and Southwest Asia. Calicut is a bustling seaport for merchants in search of spices from southern India. So we talk a lot about Calicut also in the age of European exploration. So remember, of course, that it was Vasco da Gama who reached India the first time, the Portuguese explorer. Columbus, when he accidentally landed in the West Indies, was trying to reach Calicut to buy spice. So this is a very important port city, and it has been far before the Europeans ever even knew that it existed. That foreign merchants from Arabia and China, they met in Calicut to exchange goods from the west to the east, and local rulers in Calicut welcomed the presence of Islam, and also they eventually welcomed Christian merchants because it brought wealth to the city and it made Calicut a prominent city in the Indian Ocean basin. So even in its early years, it was already a very diverse, very cosmopolitan and multicultural city because of that constant contact. In terms of different products that are in demand from the Indian Ocean basin, this actually is a better representation of the Silk Road, but in any case, I thought I'd use it because I couldn't find the best images. So the specialized products that are coming from India are the most important one, I would argue, would be textiles, right? Fabric. So cotton, of course, comes from India, and from there were textile industries, right? So they are meticulously weaving this cotton into things like carpets and expensive clothing. Also, steel came from the region, high carbon steel, so this was used for making knives and swords. Also, they were good with working with leather, so there were tanneries in India, so they would create, of course, very valuable products of leather clothing, saddles, right? Things of those nature. Uh, so craft workers, artisans that worked with leather could make quite a bit of money on this trade network. And also there were stone workers prominent in the region. And pepper was a very valuable spice that came from India as well. If we go down, I want a better map here. Let's go to Malaysia. I realize that I didn't give you a very good map before, so I just wanted to indicate where Malaysia is while I'm talking about it, right? So the modern day Malaysia, this area was known as the Spice Islands because they were well known for their nutmeg, their cinnamon, their cloves, and other very fragrant spices. The Swahili city-states, let's go back. The Swahili city-states from East Africa, this is also not on the map, silly Miss Sutton, but we've already talked about those pretty recently. Remember that they are well known for their slave trade, their ivory, and their gold trade. Now we can see the China trade. Remember, of course, silk, porcelain, fancier dishes made out of porcelain we still call fine china, right? So if you think about the china cabinet in your dining room, let's say, it's named after the country. Think about that. Anyway, Southwest Asia was known well for its trading of horses, figs, dates, so some exotic products there. All right. So the weather made ocean trade difficult because of the monsoon seasons. So merchants found that they really had to time their voyages carefully. Oftentimes they would remain in port cities for months at a time because if they did not leave when the winds were going in the right direction, they could find themselves lost at sea or they could have another problem. I mean, essentially their trade voyage could be ruined. So as a result of this, many merchants ended up interacting with the surrounding cultures and people of the region because essentially it was like they were hanging out for several months at a time waiting for the weather to change. Some merchants actually stayed in Western Indian port cities permanently. Part of this is because they would marry women that lived there. So this actually brings a further Muslim presence to the region because oftentimes when these Muslim traders meet and marry women in these trade ports, the women end up converting to Islam. So merchants from Dar-al-Islam were the first to bring that religion to South Asia, and they're not doing it in a forced. They're not forcing conversions. They're not doing it militarily, and they're not doing it through missionary work. This was just a conversion because they happened to live there and because they happened to marry into another society. So travelers also needed ships that were capable of navigating the Indian Ocean's wind cycles. So there's actually an historical debate about whether it was the Arab sailors that invented the triangular lateen sails, which they used on their boats called dhows, spelled like that. So the shape of these sails easily caught winds coming from many different directions. And again, like I said, the monsoon winds were a little less easy to predict, so these sail shapes definitely came in handy. The Chinese sailors during this period also developed a very important form of naval technology. They started to use rudders in the back of ships, which made them easier to maneuver. So the Chinese ships are called the junk, right? And they are characterized by this rudder, which we essentially see on, I can't even think of a ship that doesn't have a rudder these days, but I don't have the best nautical knowledge, so feel free to correct me below if I'm totally off there. In any case, let's talk about religion in South Asia. So before Islam arrives in the region, most people in South Asia, mainly India, practiced either Hinduism, and there were still a small number of Buddhists, but as we've already established, Buddhism becomes much more popular in East Asia than it ever was in its birthplace of India. So, Islam is a starkly different religion compared to Hinduism, which was the predominant religion before. So, a couple of examples, hopefully pretty obvious once we think about it. So, Hinduism is polytheistic, and Islam is monotheistic. All right? The Hindu temples and their artwork often have pictures of deities. It is very common to see artistic portrayals of their gods in Hindu art. But in Muslim art, it is forbidden to have any sort of visual representation of Allah. Hindus also, of course, have a caste system. The Muslims do not believe in that. They believe that everyone is equal in the eyes of God. So clearly, when Islam reaches this region, this is going to come into conflict with the previously established social order. Hindus, however, interpret their religion slightly more loosely. So some of this is because there are multiple sacred texts in Hinduism. And this is also a major contrast from Islam, which relies completely on the Quran. But despite the fact that Islam and Hinduism are very different, these two religions do coexist for a long period of time. We do see an increasing presence of Islam. However, Hinduism does remain the majority religion in most of India, even during the periods when it was ruled directly by Muslims. So Islam enters India in a number of different ways, sometimes militarily, sometimes peacefully. We already talked about how oftentimes merchants almost organically spread the religion by marrying women who would then convert. We discussed earlier that Mahmud of Ghazni, when he invaded India, he destroyed Hindu and Buddhist shrines when he tried to spread Islam, which wasn't particularly successful. The conversion efforts were not as successful, arguably, as the voluntary conversions to Islam that happened so frequently. Very often, as I said earlier, it was through marriage. Also, you saw sometimes people convert to Islam for pragmatic reasons, maybe because they wanted to better their relationship in a trade network or something along those lines. There was also a huge appeal to Islam by members of the caste system that were low on the social ranks. So if you were in a lower caste in Hindu society, you thought that you had potential for upward mobility because the caste system treated everyone equally. Now, unfortunately, this did not have the kind of effect that these people wanted, but still this was a motivation for conversion. And the largest number of people who converted in India to Islam were actually Buddhists. Part of this was because there was widespread corruption among Buddhist monks in India at this point, and there were raids on monasteries. So the Buddhist religion in India was very disorganized. Remember that Buddhism was waning in India where it was gaining strength in Asia. So this actually was not surprising that the remaining Buddhists largely converted to Islam once it actually reached India. And the spread of Islam helped make Buddhism essentially a minority religion in the place of its birth.